Hey, what's going on, everybody? So recently I've been pondering this idea. What do our lives look like whenever we push for God's blessing? We push for God's favor. I know there have been many times in my life when I've made the mistake of saying to myself, well, I bet that God's will and God's favor and God's blessing are on the other side of this decision. So what I need to do is I need to push to make it happen. And I end up living outside of God's will, doing things outside of His desire for me. And I end up really just hurting myself in the long run. Maybe you find yourself in a similar kind of position today. Maybe you find yourself single and you really want God to bring you a spouse. You really want companionship. And along the way, you've pushed to try to make some relationships work, and they've ultimately just harmed you because you pushed for God's will. You pushed for God's blessing outside of His time. Maybe you find yourself in a position like that, but it has more to do with your career, your job, and you really want that promotion and you're pushing, but you're hurting people along the way. Your family sees you less and less. You're making decisions that don't necessarily work well with who you say you are as a follower of Jesus because you've got to push to make things happen. And maybe you've just kind of been there in some other way. You know, you've pushed your kids to a certain level or to think and to be a certain way because you think on the other side of that is God's will and favor. But as I was reading through an Old Testament book, story of a man by the name of Daniel, he and some friends of his and a bunch of other captives, for that matter, end up in Babylon. King Nebuchadnezzar has taken them away into captivity. And I was just reading through and got to Daniel chapter 1, and it just kind of hit me. This is what happens to him. Daniel chapter 1, I'm going to start reading in verse 8. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food, or with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. I just want to pause right there and look at what Daniel did. Daniel is now a captive to Babylon. He's not at home. He's having to learn new culture, new language. There's new faiths. Everything is brand new to him. He's outside of his element. And Daniel could very easily take this opportunity to try to push or force something to happen for the will of God, for God's favor and blessing for him and for his people. But Daniel does not do that. It just says he resolved not to defile himself. He resolved to stay faithful to who God had called him to be when he was home. He didn't want to change his diet. The king is trying to get these new captives to eat a certain diet that he is going to provide for them, and Daniel doesn't want to defile himself in that way. He wants to continue being faithfully obedient to who God has asked him to be from when he was at home. He just chooses faithfulness. And this is the end result. Verse 9. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. Daniel didn't push for favor. He didn't push for God's will on this front. He didn't push for God's blessing. He doesn't try to force anything. He just resolves to be faithful, to keep doing what he was supposed to be doing all along, his entire life. He just chooses faithful obedience. Yeah, I read that, and it's only a couple of verses. It's really a short read, but it felt like it packed a really powerful punch to me, because I can think of the times when I've pushed for God's favor and how I've just been hurt in the long run as a result and made mistakes that hurt my relationship with God and have hurt my relationships with other people. Maybe you can relate. Maybe you have pushed many times in the past to try to find a spouse and trying to make God's blessing and favor happen in your relationships, and you've ended up making a lot of mistakes that have cost you, that have hurt you, that have hurt people around you, that have hurt your relationship with God. Maybe you find yourself in that situation with your career, and it's just hurting people around you. What would it look like for us to just pull back off of the gas pedal for a second And just look at Daniel chapter 1 and verse 8 and just do what Daniel did. What would it look like in your relationships with people if you are single, or even if you're married, with your husband or your wife? What would it look like for you just to be faithful in your obedience right where you are? If you're single, continue being faithful. Be obedient to God's will for your life, to God's will for your body and who you'll be with and when you'll be with them. What's it look like just to resolve to not defile yourself? Resolve to faithful obedience to what God has asked. What's it look like as a husband or wife to resolve to that in your relationship, to resolve to faithfulness in your marriage? What's it look like in your career to say, I don't know if this career promotion is in God's timing right now or not. I don't know if it's God's favor or God's will that I move and have that promotion or have this new career path. I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to choose to be faithful and obedient right where I am. I'm going to use the platform God's given me as it is and not try to push for the next thing, but just say, God, I will be faithful and I will be obedient to what you would have me to do right here, right now in my sphere of influence. God, I will be faithful with the way I raise my children, with the way I deal with the relationships around me, the people that I know, the school board and soccer kids and all of the stuff, right? What's it look like just to say, I resolve not to defile myself. I resolve to faithful obedience to what God would have of me, and I will wait for his favor. I will wait for his timing. And when God is ready, his will be accomplished as he wants it to be accomplished. His favor will be bestowed as he wants his favor to be bestowed, and I will not force the issue. I just want to encourage you, to look at your life and find that one area of your life where you're really pushing hard for God's favor, for God's blessing, for something to happen, and you're pushing so hard. And I just want to encourage you, pull back a little bit, relax, and say, God, I will be faithful right where I'm at. And whatever it is you'd have me to do right here in this moment, in this season with my people, God, I will be faithful and obedient. You bring the favor. You bring whatever blessing you want to bring in your own time. I resolve not to defile myself. I hope you'll choose that. I hope you'll choose faithful obedience. Maybe you're sitting there going, you know what? Maybe there's some good stuff in the book of Daniel. I just started recently, and I'd love to read it with you. So if you want, reach out to me and say, hey, I want to read the book of Daniel. And I'd love to read it alongside of you and see what you're hearing from God as you read. And I'll share with you what God's showing me as I read through the book of Daniel. Hope you guys are doing well, and hope this encourages you to stay faithful right where you are and wait for the favor of God. Take care, guys.